Our next guest is an antique lover and a folk art lover, and he has penned his latest book. It is called Antique Memories Tales from a Lifetime of Collecting Antiques and Folk Art. And I'm joined by Shaun Markey, that author. Mark, welcome to the Shaun, welcome to the show. Great to have you here. And let's talk about, you put out your first book. Why a second book, Shaun? Was it just a matter of, I have so much more to say about antiques and folk art?
I never intended to write a second book, Derek. But I got sitting around during this pandemic and I looked at some of the material I had, and some friends of mine, they were suggesting things, and one thing led to another, and I started to write the book.
Let's talk about the book itself. So, what is the second book? How does it differ from the first?
Well, really, it's quite similar to the first book in that each chapter deals with a specific find I made over the last 5 years. And then I delve into some other topics as well affecting antiques and folk art.
And Shaun, you obviously have an eye for it. For those that are sort of beginner collectors and they're looking for something, what advice do you give to collectors that are just starting out?
Well, start small.
Right.
And start with relatively inexpensive things. But the whole key to this pastime is understanding what you're looking at. And to get understanding, you have to get your nose into books and into libraries and antique shows, flea markets, anywhere where you can talk to dealers, talk to other collectors, or read material about the topic. That's so crucial that in those early months and years that you improve your knowledge level to a point where you can start to buy with some confidence.
Let's focus in on folk art. How would you describe folk art? What exactly is folk art?
Well, it's essentially art, paintings, wood carvings, textiles that are done by untrained artists. That is an artist who doesn't have any formal training. So they decide to paint a painting, they pick up a brush and paint, and they paint. They have no idea about perspective or foreground, background. They just do the work. And that's essentially what I look for, is work by untrained artists, folk artists.
So, what is the difference between, say, antique folk art and contemporary folk art? Is there a difference?
Price.
Really? Yeah.
Antique folk art or traditional folk art tends to be more expensive because you're combining both artistic expression and age. So pre-1950, folk art, traditional folk art, we'll call it, can be much more expensive. Contemporary folk art after 1950, some of the artists, not all of them, you can have an artist that's still alive, and you have artists that have produced work in the 60s and 70s, and it tends to be less expensive, although there are exceptions.
When it comes to Canadian artists, so what are some popular Canadian folk artists?
Well, the most well-known Canadian folk artist these days is Maud Lewis from
Yeah.
the late Maud Lewis from Digby, Nova Scotia. There was sort of a first wave of Canadian folk artists back in the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s. And Atlantic Canada had several of those: Maud Lewis, Joe Norris, Joseph Sleep. And then in Quebec, there were many superb folk artists in Quebec. The Richard family, one family of carvers that did amazing things. And the prices for these folk artists are just continue to go up and up.
And Shaun, you mentioned Maud Lewis. I mean, there's been so much written about her, movies done about Maud, and documentaries done about her. Just an amazing story. Shaun, for those people that aren't familiar, can you just sort of briefly tell us about her story?
Well, she grew up and she had birth defects. She had severe rheumatoid arthritis that plagued her entire life. She married when she was 36 to another impoverished character and lived together in a very small house with heated by a wood stove. And in that environment, she painted these fantastically beautiful, naive paintings, sitting
Yeah,
by
and
the window in a little building. It was only 12 by 12 feet.
yeah, it's an amazing story. I encourage people to find out more about it. And I encourage you at home. Thanks so much, Shaun. I encourage you at home to visit antiquememories.ca and get your copy of the book.